I'll be reading from a paper called Can They Hear Me Now? A Security Analysis of Law Enforcement Wiretaps. Here's the authors. They're from the Department of Computer and Information Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And we'll begin with the abstract. Although modern communications services are susceptible to third-party eavesdropping via a wide range of possible techniques, law enforcement agencies in the U.S. and other countries generally use one of two technologies when they conduct legally authorized interception of telephones and other communications traffic. The most common of these, designed to comply with the 1994 Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, CALEA, that use a standard interface provided in network switches. This paper analyzes the security properties of these interfaces. We demonstrate that the standard CALEA interfaces are vulnerable to a range of unilateral attacks by the intercept target. In particular, because of poor design choices in the interception architecture and protocols, our experiments show it is practicable for a CALEA tapped target to overwhelm the link to law enforcement with spurious signaling messages without degrading her own traffic, effectively preventing call records as well as content from being monitored or recorded. We also identify stopgap mitigation strategies that partially mitigate some of our identified attacks. Introduction. The United States Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which became law in 1994, requires telecommunication service providers to incorporate. Okay, so this is an interesting caveat. My channel's not monetized, so that and the fact that I expect my students to use this for their class assignments should make everything I'm doing right now fine. Okay, so telecom service providers are required to include various capabilities for law enforcement wiretapping, sometimes called lawful access, into their networks. CALEA requirements first applied only to traditional voice telephone services provided by telephone companies, so wireline analog, ISDN, cellular voice, etc. Now, in recent years, however, the law has been interpreted to also cover many data services, such as 3G, cell, internet access, and non-traditional voice services, such as VoIP services offered by cable companies. Most service providers comply with CALEA by using equipment that provides a standard interface defined jointly by the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA, and Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, ATIS. In ANSI standard, J standard 25, often referred to in the industry simply as the J standard. So most providers to comply provide this standard for transmitting intercepted traffic to a law enforcement agency. So they provide that standard interface. CALEA was and continues to be controversial. Criticism of CALEA and a wiretap capability mandates in general has centered largely on questions of whether the provision of an explicit interface for wiretaps on every switch in a network inevitably makes the national communications infrastructure vulnerable to illegal and unauthorized abuse by the government or others. In this paper, we focus on a different question: whether the standard interfaces used for most CALEA wiretaps are vulnerable to manipulation by wiretap targets in ways that prevent accurate, authorized intercepts of their traffic from being collected. Okay, so that would be interesting to go into if this standard interface makes everyone more vulnerable. Instead, they're just going to focus on how to prevent this. So in previous work, we found that wiretap subjects can manipulate loop extender wiretapping technology used by law enforcement to tap analog telephone lines, enabling the target to unilaterally disable content recording, cause incorrect dialed numbers to be recorded, and interject spurious records into the interception record. Many of these vulnerabilities resulted from the use of N-band signaling in loop extender systems. By injecting spurious control signals, the target could manipulate the wiretap. The newer CALIA architecture establishes a separate out-of-band channel to communicate signaling information between the telephone service provider, TSP, and the law enforcement agency, LEA. Surprisingly, although separating signaling information from call content removes, at least in principle, many of the previously discovered vulnerabilities, the CALIA design introduces several entirely new vulnerabilities. While our existing work suggested that CALIA systems may be less susceptible to manipulation than the loop extender technology they replaced, this paper shows that the opposite appears to be true. Unlike traditional wiretapping countermeasures, for example, encryption, the attacks outlined in this paper can be conducted unilaterally by individual wiretap targets and affect the accuracy not only of the captured content, but of the captured metadata record, who called whom and when. Although encryption obfuscates communication content, it does not conceal the identities of the communicating participants. Coupled with the results of our prior work, the vulnerabilities identified in this paper raise significant questions about the reliability of wiretap evidence and suggest that the bulk of the wiretapping technologies currently employed by law enforcement are largely incapable of reliable evidence collection in the face of relatively simple countermeasures. In particular, we find that the CALIA-based wiretaps of many current communication services are readily vulnerable to denial of service by a wiretap target. Perhaps most significantly, we found practical attacks that a wiretap target can employ to overwhelm the low bandwidth signaling channel of the JStandard 25 interface. Signaling events generated by the target, such as taking a telephone off the hook, are encoded for transmission in a way that consumes far more bandwidth on the low bandwidth law enforcement signaling link than on the target's own link. A wiretapped subject can exploit this by generating a moderate volume of spurious signaling events that reliably exhaust the capacity of the signaling link to the law enforcement agency for all wiretap targets connected to a given switch without significant degradation of service to the target's actual traffic. This effectively prevents the law enforcement agency from accurately collecting or recording the true call metadata as well as the associated data traffic or audio content. As we will see, these vulnerabilities largely arise from narrow engineering choices in the CALIA architecture rooted in assumptions about average case workloads. However, a motivated wiretap subject may intentionally violate these assumptions to overwhelm the resources of the wiretap. This is especially true with wireless telephone services, which account for the vast majority of law enforcement wiretaps, where voice services are increasingly bundled with moderate and high bandwidth data services. This paper has 4 main contributions. 1, we provide the first in the public literature security analysis of the technical standards used for a large fraction of law enforcement telephone and data wiretaps in the United States. 2, we identify practical attacks against systems that implement the standard that cause incomplete or incorrect interceptions, possibly without detection, in current implementations. 3, we conduct experiments that demonstrate the feasibility and practicality of our attacks. In particular, we verify that common U.S. telecommunications carriers provide consumers with sufficient resource to exhaust the capacity of CALIA systems that implement the JStandard's recommended wiretap configuration. And last, we propose stopgap mitigation strategies that partially mitigate some of our identified attacks. Any weaknesses in CALIA wiretaps, of course, represent a pressing problem for the many law enforcement agencies that rely on them. But the failures have wider implications as well. CALIA requirements are being adopted for an increasingly broad range of communication platforms, yet there has been remarkably little published analysis of the effectiveness of the standards that are being mandated. Okay, so 1.1 wiretapping in the United States. The U.S. laws governing electronic surveillance are arcane and complex. A complete discussion is beyond the scope of this paper. The law has its basis in the Fourth Amendment with specific rules codified in various federal and state statutes and case law interpretations that have evolved over many years. For our purposes here, it is sufficient to note a few salient highlights of surveillance law as it applies to law enforcement wiretaps. In the U.S., broadly speaking and in general, third-party interception of telephone and network communications is illegal, whether done by government or private individuals, with narrow exceptions for criminal investigations and similar matters. Even when allowed, law enforcement wiretaps must be conducted under court supervision, with different requirements and standards that must be met depending on the kinds of information being collected. The procedures and requirements for federal law enforcement wiretaps are codified in Title III. Most states have essentially similar rules. Different kinds of wiretaps have different legal requirements. The most stringent legal standards apply to wiretaps that intercept the content of communication. For example, telephone call audio, text messages, etc. These taps are permitted only if the court is convinced there is sufficient probable cause and that the interception is essential to an investigation. PIN register intercepts, which seek only metadata or call identifying information, can meet a lower legal standard. All that is required in general for such taps is an assertion that the specific records involved are likely to be germane to an investigation, and PIN registers requests are not usually subject to extensive case-by-case judicial approval. Most law enforcement taps are in this category, although it is not unusual for evidence obtained from a PIN register to be used to support a request for a warrant for a content tap. 1.2 wiretapping technology. In principle, there are many possible approaches for third-party recording of analog and digital telephone and data communications, depending on the network topology and the access and other capabilities of the wiretapper. Interception might be performed at the wireline link between the target and the network, the local loop in telephony parlance within the network itself, or by bugs placed in the target's own hardware or software. Wireless devices such as cell phones can introduce an additional option, capturing and demodulating the radio signals. So they now have us jump to loop extenders, tapping the local loop. Historically, the favored approach for law enforcement wiretapping in the U.S. has been to tap the target's local loop. For analog wireline telephone calls, relatively little special hardware is required at the tap point. It is sufficient simply to connect a second pair of wires leading back to the law enforcement agency's facilities. To make such taps less detectable and to ensure proper isolation and level equalization of intercepted content, however, law enforcement agencies use a small device called a loop extender at the splice point. The device copies the audio on the subject's line over to the law enforcement line, re-encodes signals, and performs level equalization. Collection equipment at the law enforcement agency decodes the dialed digit and other call processing signals and can record the audio contents of the calls. Digital communications can often be tapped at the local loop, but the interception equipment and techniques may need to be more sophisticated to capture accurately the complex higher bandwidth signal encodings used in such modern systems. Tapping some services in this way can entail the use of highly specialized and relatively expensive equipment. And as bandwidth becomes greater and signal encodings become more complex, the loop interception can become correspondingly more difficult to perform. Kalia, tapping in the switch. So a newer wiretapping technology used by law enforcement agencies, and the subject of this paper, is based on the 1994 Kalia law. Kalia wiretaps are distinguished from loop extenders by performing the interception not at the subscriber's local loop, but rather within the switching equipment of the network provider, allowing more content-sensitive capture of digital as well as analog communications. Kalia mandates a standard set of capabilities for wiretaps in telephone and certain other communication switches. In these taps, the switch, not the law enforcement agency, decodes the call signaling information, and when content intercepted is performed, segregates content on a separate channel from the signaling. As noted above, ANSI J Standard 25 standardizes a CALIA-compliant interface between switches and law enforcement agencies. The J standard architecture and messages are described in detail in the rest of this paper. Basically, a law enforcement agency conducting CALIA interceptions typically leases one or more telephone lines between the agency's facilities and the target's telephone switch. The first of these lines carries a call data channel that reports the signaling events. So that's call times, numbers dialed, line status, etc., associated with all the lines being monitored by the agency at that switch. Additional lines to the law enforcement agency carry call content channels that contain the live audio or data stream of any active monitored lines for which content interception has been authorized. The CDC carries call data for every active target on the switch tapped by a particular agency. The CCCs, on the other hand, carry only one audio or data stream at a time, with their activity reported over the CDC. While CALIA applies only in the United States, J-standard compliant switches and interception products are marked in other countries as well. There are other approaches. Law enforcement agencies in the U.S. generally use either loop extenders or CALIA for wiretaps associated with criminal investigations. Intelligence agencies and other eavesdroppers, legal or illegal, however, may use other techniques. The range of technically possible approaches to surveillance on modern communications platforms is very wide. In this paper, however, we focus on the much more limited set of tapping techniques used by the U.S. law enforcement to gather evidence legally, and we'll end the video here. In the next one, we'll start in section 2.